In 1838, a pastor named Johann Blumhardt was assigned to serve in a small village called Möttlingen, Germany. The village was quiet, with a modest population. Life there was simple and peaceful. No one could have imagined that this place would become the center of a mysterious and disturbing series of events. In 1840, a family named Dittus moved into the ground floor of a house in the village. The family consisted of 5 siblings. Their parents had already passed away. One of the brothers was blind in one eye. The youngest sibling was Gottliebin Dittus, a 25-year-old woman with long-standing health problems. She needed assistance to urinate, had a spinal deformity, and one of her legs was shorter than the other. She was quiet, religious, and occasionally wrote short poems and hymns. On their first night in the house, during a prayer before dinner, Gottliebin suddenly collapsed from her chair. She had convulsions, her eyes rolled back, and she lost consciousness. At first, the family assumed it was a typical medical episode. But then, knocking sounds began, from the walls, the ceiling, and the floor. The sounds grew louder and seemed to move around the house. Some knocks felt like they were coming from beneath the floorboards, trying to rise up. The candlelight in the room flickered irregularly. Shadows on the walls shifted in ways that didn't match the candle's flame. The air turned cold despite the windows being shut. There was no wind. These phenomena occurred repeatedly, especially during prayers. The knocking returned often, sometimes so forceful that the furniture shook. Gottliebin's condition worsened. Some days she lay still as if lifeless, barely breathing. Other times, she ran a fever or shivered intensely. Her symptoms fluctuated without pattern or explanation. Pastor Blumhardt began visiting the family regularly. Each time, Gottliebin reacted strangely. She refused to speak to him. If he offered to pray, she would press her hands together but separate them as soon as he began. Sometimes, she wouldn't even look at him. After several months, her siblings finally admitted that something was truly wrong with the house. They heard footsteps, knocking, and what sounded like something crawling along the walls at night. Gottliebin told them she had been seeing a woman standing by her bed every night. That woman was someone from the village who had died 2 years earlier. She appeared holding a dead child in her arms. Whenever she appeared, she would say the same sentence, "Let me rest in peace. I will not return if I get what I want." This was the beginning of what would become a 2-year ordeal. What started with a fainting spell at a family dinner would soon engulf the whole household, drawing Pastor Blumhardt into a case he had never imagined confronting. After the first night, daily life for the Dittus family changed completely. Every time they prayed in the house, the knocking would return. There was no clear source. The sounds weren't coming from old wooden beams or an upstairs neighbor. They came from unexpected places, like the middle of the floor or untouched walls. Some nights, the knocking moved around the house. It would begin in the ceiling, shift to the walls, then down to the floor, and rise again. There were dragging sounds too, like something sliding across the wooden boards. These noises woke the family even on the most exhausting days. Candles behaved strangely. Their flames flickered without any wind. The shadows on the walls moved unnaturally, not matching the movements of the flames. Some shadows appeared to shift on their own, without a clear source. At times, the entire house trembled slightly while the knocking continued. Tables and chairs shook, and the water in drinking glasses rippled, without anyone touching the furniture. Temperature changes were also noted. Rooms became unusually cold during prayer, even with all windows and doors shut. There was no explanation. Gottliebin's physical condition worsened. She went from violent convulsions to being completely still for hours, barely breathing. Her siblings had to check if she was still alive. Whenever guests came to visit, especially religious figures, her behavior changed dramatically. She would refuse to speak or respond. She avoided eye contact and remained silent during prayers. The events weren't limited to nighttime. During the day, the family heard unexplained knocks. Furniture made noise without being touched. These things happened even when only one person was in the house. Neighbors began noticing strange things too. Some heard knocking sounds while walking past the house. Others said they felt cold or sensed someone watching them through the windows that appeared completely dark from outside. Gottliebin's behavior continued to shift. Some days she wandered silently through the house. Other days she lay unresponsive. During prayers, her body tensed, limbs shook, and she sometimes made low groaning sounds, as if in pain or resistance. With the disturbances growing and no natural explanation, the Dittus family shared everything with Pastor Blumhardt. After receiving repeated reports from the Dittus family, Pastor Johann Blumhardt began closely observing Gottliebin's behavior. At first, she didn't display the more extreme symptoms when he was present. But the changes her family described were consistent and increasing. In the fall of 1841, Gottliebin developed a severe facial infection. Doctors believed it was a type of skin inflammation. Medical treatment was limited at the time, and her condition worsened quickly. Pastor Blumhardt decided to visit her at home to offer support. During each visit, he noticed subtle changes. She often refused to greet him, turned her face away, or ignored his questions. If he started to pray, she would fold her hands briefly, only to release them as soon as the prayer began. Her reactions were markedly different when he was in the room. Blumhardt grew concerned. He began to suspect that her condition might not be purely physical. Still, he did not make conclusions about supernatural causes. Instead, he recorded his observations carefully. In April 1842, Gottliebin's siblings reported new developments. The knocking sounds had grown louder and more frequent. The noises moved from room to room and could now be heard from outside the house. Gottliebin also reported seeing the same woman she had described earlier, the one who had died 2 years ago. This time, the woman appeared more frequently and seemed to approach her bed. The messages from the apparition were always similar. The woman asked to be left in peace and implied that something needed to be returned or fulfilled. With this information, Blumhardt increased the frequency of his visits. He began involving other witnesses, including friends of the family, to observe events. One night, a woman staying with Gottliebin saw a faint light move through the room. She followed it and discovered a bundle of old paper beneath the bed, wrapped around several coins and stained with soot. The origin of the objects was unknown. They appeared deliberately hidden. Blumhardt collected them and sent them for examination in a nearby town. Tests showed no poisons or chemicals, but the items were described as possibly linked to folk rituals. Despite the removal and destruction of these objects, the disturbances did not stop. In fact, the activity seemed to intensify. As the knocking continued and more witnesses heard the sounds, even from outside the house, Pastor Blumhardt decided to involve trusted members of the community in a nighttime investigation. On June 3, 1842, a group entered the Dittus home before 10 p.m. The group included local officials, witnesses, and the village mayor. Soon after they entered, 2 loud crashes came from the bedroom. The sounds were so intense that even people outside heard them clearly. No source for the noise could be found. For several hours, the knocking persisted. A chair lifted from the ground and dropped on its own in front of multiple witnesses. Windows rattled, though there was no wind. Sand fell from the ceiling, and small tremors were felt throughout the house. To confirm the phenomena, the observers were positioned in separate rooms. All of them reported similar experiences: shaking furniture, untraceable sounds, and cold drafts with no explanation. On June 4th, after relocating Gottliebin for safety, a team began to examine the house more thoroughly. They focused on areas where the disturbances had been strongest. Beneath a loose wooden floorboard, they found a bundle of old paper containing a black powdery substance, ancient coins, and a small clay container with a sealed lid. Inside the container were soil and fragments resembling bones. One witness with burial experience believed they looked like the bones of a small child. Later, a physician said they might be bird bones, but the arrangement of the items suggested a ritualistic purpose. The discovery fueled speculation that the house had been used for unknown practices in the past. This belief matched earlier reports about a woman's ghost carrying a dead child, and rumors of unexplained infant deaths in the village. To prevent panic, Blumhardt sent the objects to the nearby city of Kull for further analysis. No harmful substances were found, but one report concluded that the items may relate to local folk traditions. The objects were destroyed by fire. However, this did not end the disturbances. In fact, the knocking increased in frequency and now occurred even when the house was empty. Neighbors began to report hearing the sounds from outside. Some claimed the noises continued at all hours, despite the house being locked and unoccupied. After the buried items beneath the floor were found and destroyed, the disturbances inside the Dittus home did not stop. Instead, the activity became more intense and frequent, both during the day and night. Knocking sounds continued in different parts of the house, including times when it was unoccupied. Some knocks were loud enough to be heard by passers-by on the street. Several witnesses confirmed hearing distinct knocking sounds from outside the home, even when no one was inside. Inside the house, objects began to move without physical contact. One notable event involved a wooden table. Witnesses reported hearing a knock from inside the table, followed by a slight tremor, and then the table lifted off the floor and slammed back down, without anyone nearby. These phenomena occurred even when Gottliebin was not in the house. At one point, while she was staying with relatives, her blind brother who remained behind reported knocking and shaking furniture multiple times during the night. Later that month, Pastor Blumhardt organized another investigation. He invited new observers, including government officials, a physician, and local council members. Each was placed in different rooms of the house to observe independently. During the night, a loud crashing noise came from the bedroom. It was followed by rapid knocking, like hammering. Furniture shook. Doors rattled. But no one could find a physical cause. Those upstairs said the noise came from below. Those downstairs believed it came from the ceiling. This suggested the source of the sound moved vertically through the house. At one point, a fine sand-like substance fell from the ceiling. It was not plaster or dust, and the ceiling showed no visible damage. Meanwhile, at her relative's home, Gottliebin's condition worsened. Her body twisted unnaturally, her limbs convulsed, and a deep groaning came from her throat. Those nearby contacted Blumhardt immediately. He returned to her location and found her symptoms more severe than ever. Her body was rigid, arms and legs trembled, and her facial expression shifted dramatically. None of these symptoms matched known medical conditions of the time. In response, Pastor Blumhardt began keeping a more systematic record. He noted dates, times, witnesses, and events in detail. This methodical approach would later form the foundation of his formal report. As the disturbances worsened and Gottliebin's condition became more severe, Pastor Blumhardt expanded his efforts. He brought in more witnesses and closely monitored her reactions. In mid-1842, during a visit with a group of local women, Gottliebin began to show extreme symptoms. Her body twisted unnaturally, her head turned in strange directions, and her limbs jerked without control. A sound, low and angry, came from her throat. Blumhardt approached and began to pray, invoking the name of Jesus. At that moment, Gottliebin opened her eyes, and a voice came from her mouth. It was not her usual voice. The tone was deep, rough, and foreign. It said, "I cannot bear to hear that name." Witnesses agreed that this voice did not match Gottliebin's natural speech. It had a different pitch, rhythm, and emotional tone. It appeared to originate from within her but was not hers. This was the first time Blumhardt recorded a direct verbal response during prayer. He began asking questions, and the voice answered. According to his records, the voice claimed to be the spirit of the woman who had died 2 years earlier, the same one Gottliebin had described seeing by her bed. The spirit said she could not rest in her grave because she had not been forgiven. She confessed to having killed 2 children and burying them in a field. She also said she could not pray or speak the name of Jesus. Blumhardt remained cautious. He did not declare this a demonic possession but referred to it as an unidentified presence. Still, he observed a clear pattern. Whenever he mentioned Jesus or began to pray, the voice reacted strongly and showed distress. At one point, when he asked the presence to leave, it responded with sadness, asking not to be cast out. Then it became aggressive, demanding to remain. Blumhardt continued praying, and over time, Gottliebin's body relaxed. The voice fell silent, and she returned to a calmer state. This marked the beginning of ongoing interactions with what Blumhardt described as multiple entities. There were several voices, each with distinct characteristics. Some were defiant, others fearful or sorrowful. The events became increasingly complex. Following the initial vocal exchanges with the unknown presence, the situation around Gottliebin grew more complex. Pastor Blumhardt noticed that the voices speaking through her were not always the same. They differed in tone, manner, and emotional state. Some were angry. Some were fearful. Some refused to speak the name of Jesus. He began referring to them as multiple beings. On several occasions, numbers like 14, 175, or even over 400 were mentioned, suggesting a large number of presences involved. At the same time, physical anomalies became more severe. Gottliebin began to vomit objects that should not be inside any human body. These included sewing needles, glass shards, fine sand, nails, and bits of wire. Some items were so large that she stopped breathing momentarily while expelling them. Witnesses sometimes had to help remove the objects directly from her mouth. More disturbing were reports of living creatures emerging from her body. Large insects, toads, and even bat-like creatures were said to come out, fully alive and mobile. Witnesses claimed that these beings moved naturally after being expelled. In one instance, Gottliebin claimed she saw something like a snake crawl out of her throat and disappear into a dark corner of the room. Blumhardt did not see a snake, but reported seeing a strange light move quickly across the room. A bite-like mark was later found on her neck. Witnesses also noted that despite the many sharp objects emerging from her mouth, Gottliebin's body showed little to no injury. There were no serious wounds, no visible bleeding, and no signs of lasting damage to her throat or digestive system. Because of the extraordinary nature of these events, Blumhardt insisted on always having independent observers present. Each episode was documented in detail. In late 1843, the phenomena affecting Gottliebin entered another disturbing phase. It now involved significant blood loss from her body, with no clear medical explanation. One night, while Pastor Blumhardt was away visiting another member of the congregation, he was urgently called back to the house where Gottliebin was staying. When he arrived early the next morning, he found her seated in the middle of the room, covered in blood. Blood had flowed from multiple points on her head, face, and ears. A bucket of water nearby had been used to collect the blood, which was now mixed with water and nearly full. Trails of blood stretched across the floor. Upon closer inspection, Blumhardt noticed a small iron nail emerging from the skin just above her right eyebrow. He also felt a hard lump at the back of her head. Hours later, a wooden peg-like object surfaced from that spot. Over the following days, these bleeding episodes continued. The volume of blood she lost each time was unusually high, yet Gottliebin remained alive and seemed to recover rapidly between incidents. Witnesses described the smell of the blood as foul and unlike ordinary human blood. Its color was dark, almost black, and it flowed from areas that, initially, had no visible injury. A physician who examined her afterward could not determine how the foreign objects had emerged from her scalp or how she could lose so much blood without fatal consequences. There were no visible wounds that matched the amount of blood seen. These events began to take a toll on the people around her. Blumhardt himself, in his writings, admitted that the constant exposure to unexplained suffering was wearing him down. He began to question whether he could continue. He also began to feel that the force behind these events might now be turning its attention toward him. Toward the end of 1843, the unusual occurrences surrounding Gottliebin expanded to include her family members. Her sister Katharina and her visually impaired brother began showing signs of distress and abnormal behavior. Katharina, in particular, experienced sudden emotional outbursts. She screamed, attempted to attack others, and, on one occasion, lunged at Pastor Blumhardt and tried to tear his clothing. Witnesses describe her voice as sounding like several people speaking at once, a layered, unnatural tone that they could not explain. Blumhardt and his assistants intervened. They held continuous prayer sessions while physically restraining the sisters when necessary. Sometimes, Gottliebin and Katharina exhibited extreme agitation at the same time. They struck their heads against walls, pulled at their own hair, or attempted to harm those around them. On the night of Christmas 1843, a special prayer service began at midnight. It was attended by a large number of witnesses. The house shook with violent sounds, screaming, crying, and pounding, so loud that villagers heard them from several houses away. According to Blumhardt's report, the most intense moment came around 2 a.m. Katharina's body twisted in extreme ways, defying normal human movement. A voice came from her mouth, repeating the phrase, "Jesus is victor." The voice repeated the phrase several times before gradually fading away. By morning, both sisters appeared physically and emotionally exhausted, but calm. In the days that followed, the strange events ceased. No more unexplained knocking. No objects moved. No bleeding or voices. Blumhardt concluded that something had come to an end. He noted that the disturbances left behind only faint traces, like an echo slowly disappearing. After Christmas 1843, the disturbances in the Dittus home came to a complete stop. No more voices, knocking, or strange events occurred. The house returned to its normal state. The surrounding villagers no longer reported strange sounds, and the sense of unease that had settled over Möttlingen slowly faded. Gottliebin recovered quickly. Her chronic illnesses, including problems with urination, spinal deformities, and the shorter leg, seemed to disappear. There is no record of further medical treatment. She resumed a normal life and began working as a housekeeper and caregiver for children. She lived in the household of Pastor Blumhardt himself, indicating that trust had been fully restored. Meanwhile, Pastor Blumhardt spent the following years compiling a full report of the events. His documentation covered the period from 1841 to 1843. He arranged the material chronologically and included the names of witnesses to strengthen credibility. The full report was not widely published. Only 100 copies were printed, and they were kept within church circles. Blumhardt later said he published the report reluctantly, only after being directed to do so by his superiors. He feared that many would dismiss the case or question his judgment. Still, he believed the record had value as a historical and spiritual document. In his writings, Blumhardt emphasized that he had not worked alone. Many people, including clergy, medical professionals, and local authorities, had participated in observing and verifying the events. There is little information about Gottliebin's later life, but sources suggest she lived peacefully and without further incidents until her death. The case of Gottliebin Dittus did not only affect her family. It had lasting effects on the village community and on the religious work of Pastor Johann Christoph Blumhardt. After the events ended, peace gradually returned to Möttlingen. Villagers who had distanced themselves from religious life began returning to church services. Interest in prayer and faith increased noticeably. Some families began hosting small prayer groups or home-based Bible studies. Blumhardt's role as a spiritual leader gained recognition beyond the village. People from other regions came seeking advice or healing. Some traveled great distances to ask for his prayers or spiritual guidance. Eventually, he founded a retreat center called Bad Bowl, aimed at providing care for those suffering in body or spirit. He later acknowledged that the Dittus case helped inspire this effort. While many supported his work, some within the church questioned his methods and interpretations. Blumhardt admitted in private letters that publishing the report brought criticism. He remained cautious and emphasized that the goal had never been to display supernatural power, but to demonstrate the outcome of steady prayer and unwavering faith. He also credited the involvement of others. Doctors, local leaders, and fellow clergy helped document and verify what happened. For the local church, the Dittus case marked a shift. It showed that spiritual challenges could unite a community, reshape its priorities, and influence the structure of local ministry. The case of Gottliebin Dittus remains one of the most thoroughly documented instances of what, in its time, was seen as spiritual oppression or possession. Pastor Johann Christoph Blumhardt kept detailed records from 1841 to 1844, offering a rare view into how such events were perceived and addressed in 19th century Germany. While the case was initially regarded as proof of spiritual victory through prayer, it has since attracted scholarly attention across many fields: religion, psychiatry, anthropology, and historical studies. Some researchers believe Gottliebin's symptoms may align with dissociative disorders or psychogenic seizures. Others point to cultural stress, religious expectations, and the lack of medical knowledge at the time as possible explanations. Blumhardt's careful wording in his report stands out. He never directly called the experience demonic possession. Instead, he described it as an unexplained manifestation, or something that expressed itself through a person. The fact that the ordeal ended without physical death or lasting injury, and that Gottliebin returned to a stable life, has drawn interest. Some see it as evidence that strong communal support, consistent caregiving, and structured religious practice may have played key roles in recovery. Original copies of Blumhardt's first edition report are now rare. However, modern translations have brought the case to broader attention, especially among religious groups interested in healing and spiritual conflict. Today, the Dittus case is often cited in discussions about the intersection of belief, trauma, and unexplained psychological phenomena. It challenges both religious and scientific frameworks to account for human experience under extreme conditions. There is no single explanation that fully accounts for what happened. What remains are the records, the testimonies, and a quiet reminder that some events in human history resist simple understanding and still speak to the limits of what we know.